This is Lecture 65A that accompanies Chapter 68 in Volume 4 of Oceania in the series The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018. And our subject today is Polynesia, from primitive communism to the slave stage, Part 1. Polynesia is one of three sub-regions of Oceania, the other two being Melanesia and Micronesia, which we've covered in previous lectures and chapters. It consists of over 1,000 islands scattered over the central and southern Pacific Ocean. The indigenous people who inhabit the islands of Polynesia are called Polynesians, and they share a language family and a common material and ideological culture. Prehistorically, they were sailing peoples with navigators skilled in the reading of winds and swells and could use stars to navigate at night. There is an episode called The Castaways on Netflix's South Pacific series that describes much of the encyclopedic knowledge people had then and that we have now about the plant and animal and human migration from Melanesia to these Polynesian islands. Now, the homeland of Polynesia is the island of Tonga, and as you will see, everything begins in Tonga. That is, the culture area that we know as Polynesia radiates from the island of Tonga. Now, I mention it here so that you know where the rest of the lecture and chapter is heading. And I think we'll stop here for a moment so we can take a look at the map of Polynesia, and you can see where all of these are. I have relied extensively on a book called On the Road of the Winds by the archaeologist Patrick Vincent Kirch, K-I-R-C-H. Now, the book I have, and it's in your libraries, was published 17 years ago in the year 2000. So I wrote to him a week or two ago, and he wrote back saying that, yes, there is a second edition coming out in January of 2018. So I just want to mention that now. About the time you get this textbook, that book will also be available, and perhaps you could order it for your libraries or for yourself. I think you'll find it's extremely useful. This particular archaeologist is a professor at the moment in Berkeley, but he was born and raised in Hawaii, and so he has a long special interest in that entire area, which is reflected quite well in his book On the Road of the Winds, first edition, now second edition. At any rate, in 1756, the term Polynesia was first used by a French writer named Charles de Brosses. He applied it to all the islands of the Pacific. And in 1831, Jules Dumont d'Urville proposed a restriction on its use, that is the term, during a lecture to the Geographical Society of Paris. Now, historically, these islands have also been referred to as the South Sea Islands. Taking a look at the geology of Polynesia, it's a small amount of land, as you can see, spread over a very large portion of the middle and southern Pacific Ocean. Most Polynesian islands are archipelagos, including the Hawaiian Islands and Samoa, and are composed of volcanic islands built by hotspots on the sunken continent of Zealandia. The Polynesian Triangle, that is New Zealand, Norfolk Island, Ovea, and the Polynesian outlier near New Caledonia, are the unsubmerged portions of that largely sunken continent. 23 million years ago, most of Zealandia sunk beneath the ocean's surface. It then resurfaced due to a change in the movements of the Pacific and Indo-Australian plates that uplifted the New Zealand portion. Now, the Zealandia continent has 1,400,000 square miles of continental shelf. The oldest rocks in the region are in New Zealand and are about 510 million years old. The oldest Polynesian rocks outside of Zealandia are in the Hawaiian Emperor Seamount chain and are 80 million years old. At first, the Pacific plate was subducted under the Australian plate. The alpine fault that traverses the South Island of New Zealand is currently a transform fault, while the convergent plate boundary from the North Island northwards is called the Kermadec, Tonga, subduction zone. The volcanism associated with this subduction zone created the Kermadec and Tongan Island archipelagos. Out of approximately 118,000 square miles of land, over 103,000 square miles are within New Zealand. The Hawaiian archipelago comprises about half of the remainder. Now, the geography of Polynesia consists mainly of the islands within the Polynesian Triangle. The Polynesian Triangle is drawn by connecting the points of Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island. The main island groups located near the Polynesian Triangle are Samoa, Tonga, the Cook Islands, Tuvalu, Tokelau, Niue, Wallis and Futuna, and French Polynesia. However, there are some islands inhabited by Polynesian people outside of that triangle. And there are also small Polynesian settlements in Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, the Caroline Islands, and in Vanuatu. An island group with strong Polynesian cultural traits outside of this Great Triangle is Rotuma, situated north of Fiji, that have many common Polynesian traits, but the people speak a non-Polynesian language. The Lau, that is Lau, islands to the southeast of Fiji have a strong historic and cultural link with Tonga. Now, these exceptions are to be expected given the history of neighboring chiefdoms. Which brings us to the primitive communism and simple chiefdoms section of this chapter. Linguistic, archaeological, and human genetic ancestry puts Polynesian peoples into a subset of ocean migratory Austronesian-speaking people. Between about 5,000 and 3,000 BP, speakers of Austronesian languages began spreading from Taiwan into island Southeast Asia. Tracing Polynesian languages places their prehistoric origins in Taiwan and then the Malay archipelago. There are three theories regarding the spread of humans across the Pacific to Polynesia that are outlined well by Kaiser et al. In an article in Current Biology in the year 2000, but I'm only going to mention the first one, which is the express train model that is in this lecture, where a 5,000 to 3,000 BP expansion began from Taiwan. These people headed through the Philippines and eastern Indonesia to the northwest, or Bird's Head part of New Guinea. Then on to island Melanesia by roughly 3,400 BP. The express reaching the western Polynesian islands around 1900 BP. Now, this theory is supported by the majority of current genetic, linguistic, and archaeological data, and in your textbook you'll see that I do deal with two other ideas about this, but I'm going to just concentrate on what I think is the correct way in this particular lecture. In the archaeological record, there are well-defined traces of this expansion which allow the path it took to be followed and dated with some certainty. By 3,400 BP, Lapita pottery-carrying people appeared in the Bismarck archipelago of northwest Melanesia. Now, this culture adapted and evolved through time and space since its emergence from Taiwan. They had given up rice production in favor of breadfruit in Bird's Head, New Guinea. In the previous chapter on Melanesia, we discussed research at the Toma Lapita site on Ifate Island in Vanuatu and the Talasia Lapita site near Nuku'alofa in Tonga. Now, new data published in 2016 supports the express trade model with the qualification that the migration bypassed New Guinea and island Melanesia. The conclusion is that the initial population of those two sites appears to come directly from Taiwan or the northern Philippines and did not mix with the Australo-Papuans of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Either way, one thing is clear, and that is the general temporal and spatial trajectory of migration into Polynesia. The preliminary analysis of skulls found at the Tioma Talasio Lapita sites is that they lack Australian or Papuan affinities, and instead they have affinities to mainland Asia populations. DNA analysis of modern Polynesians indicates that there was intermarriage that resulted in a mixed Asian Papuan ancestry for the Polynesians. This research at the Tioma and Talasio Lapita sites implies that the migration and intermarriage resulted in the mixed Asian Papuan ancestry of the Polynesians and occurred after the first initial migration to Vanuatu and Tonga. The most eastern site for Lapita archaeological remains recovered so far is at Muli Fanua on Upolu. The Muli Fanua site has 4,288 pottery sherds radiocarbon dated to 3000 BP. A 2010 study places the beginning of the human archaeological sequences in Polynesia in Tonga at 2900 BP. Pretty close. Within a mere 3 or 4 centuries between 3300 and 2900 BP, the Lapita archaeological culture spread 3,600 miles further to the east from the Bismarck archipelago. Eventually it reached as far as Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, which were first populated around 3,000 years ago. A cultural divide then developed between Fiji to the west and the distinctive Polynesian language and culture emerging on Tonga and Samoa to the east. Now, faint evidence of uniquely shared developments in Fijian and Polynesian speech is now called borrowing. Contacts were buffered through the eastern Lau Islands of Fiji, where most Fijian-Polynesian linguistic interaction occurred, with tiny populations involved. Polynesians were matrilineal in descent reckoning and matrilocal in postmarital residence upon arrival in Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa via the Bismarck archipelago. Modern Polynesians show human genetic derivation from Melanesia that allowed indigenous men, but not women, to marry in, and this is evidence for matrilocality. Culture and time. Originally, Polynesians and most other Austronesian speakers in the Pacific Islands were matrilineal descent reckoning and matrilocal postmarital residence cultures. They remained highly matricentric, or as Professor George Mead puts it, matrifocal, as they evolved from primitive communism through the chiefdom transition. Lapita pottery also went away in western Polynesia as professional specialization of utilitarian ceramic wares took hold in the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage. By the time eastern Polynesia was being settled, after a pause of 1,000 years or more in western Polynesia, language, social life, and material culture emerged that were distinctly Polynesian. A 2010 meta-analysis of radiocarbon dates indicates the colonization of eastern Polynesia, including Hawaii and New Zealand, proceeded in 2 short episodes. First of all, the Society Islands from AD 1025 to 1120. Secondly, another from AD 1190 to 1290, with Easter Island being settled around AD 1200. Other archaeological models challenge that set of radiocarbon dating interpretations, and these point to dates of between AD 300 and AD 500 or AD 800 for the settlement of Eastern Island, and similarly a date of AD 500 for Hawaii. Linguistically, there is a very distinct East Polynesian subgroup with many shared innovations not seen in other Polynesian languages. The Marquesas Islands dialects are perhaps the source of the oldest Hawaiian speech that is overlain by a Tahitian variety of speech, as Hawaiian oral histories would suggest. The earliest varieties of New Zealand Maori speech may have had multiple sources from around central eastern Polynesia, as Maori oral histories would suggest. Now we come to class and state in Tonga. The Kingdom of Tonga is a Polynesian sovereignty. While exposed to colonial pressures, Tonga has always governed itself, which makes it unique in the Pacific. The Treaty of Friendship and Tonga Protection status ended in 1970 under arrangements between Queen Salote Turpo III before her death in 1965. Tonga joined the Commonwealth of Nations in 1970, atypically as a country with its own monarch rather than that of United Kingdom, similar to Malaysia, Lesotho, and Swaziland, and became a member of the United Nations in September 1999. As part of cost-cutting measures across the British Foreign Service, the British government closed the British High Commission in Nuku'alofa in March 2006, transferring representation of British interest to the High Commissioner in Fiji. The last resident British High Commissioner was Paul Nestle. Now, it is an archipelago comprising 169 islands, of which 36 are inhabited. Tonga, that is. The total surface area is 200 square miles, scattered over 200,000 square miles of ocean. It has a population of 103,000 people, of whom 70% reside on the main island of Tonga Tapu. Physiographically, Tonga stretches across 500 miles in a north-south line, and it is surrounded by Fiji and Wallis and Futuna of France to the northwest, Samoa to the northeast, Niue to the east, Kermadec, part of New Zealand, to the southwest, and New Caledonia, which is French, and Vanuatu to the farther west. Now, the primitive communist mariner farmers, the Lapita. Limu, that's L-I-M-U, is an island in Tonga. It is located within the Hapai group in the center of the country, to the northeast of the national capital of Nuku'alofa. The Hapai group of 3,500 years ago was a bit different from the Hapai of today. Large flightless birds called megapodes bounded through the tropical rainforest, while giant iguanas and various other lizards rested on tree limbs. The skies hosted 3 different species of fruit bat, 3 different species of pigeon, and more than 24 other types of birds. There were no pigs, horses, dogs, cows, rats, or people. In fact, the South Pacific was almost completely uninhabited. Humans were on the western fringes of the Solomon Islands. Then, around that time, these islanders were suddenly replaced by a new branch of humanity that originated from the Bismarck Archipelago off Papua New Guinea. They intrepidly stormed through the region, rapidly colonizing and pushing east. They brought with them new plant and animal species, as well as a distinct pottery design. Today, these people are named the Lapita, after the location in New Caledonia, where they were first identified archaeologically. By 3500 BP, an Austronesian-speaking group of the Lapita archaeological culture had reached and inhabited Tonga. However, the first radiocarbon date on these settlers is from the oldest town, Nukuleka, at 2826 BP. When the Lapita people reached Tonga, their first landfall was Tonga Tapu, and then in Hapai soon after. The newcomers were already tribal agricultural mariners, well adapted to the resource-scarce island life. They settled into small communities of a few households on beaches just above high tide line that faced open lagoons or reefs. Through continued interaction with their Lapita relatives in the west, the Hapaians obtained domesticated animals and cultivatable plants. For the first 200 years of occupation in the Hapai group, they relied on marine resources, parrotfish, wrasses, turtles, surgeonfish, jacks, eels, emperors, bottom dwellers, shellfish, and the occasional deep water tuna, just as their Polynesian descendants do today. The seafood was inexhaustible, as reefs then were not much different from reefs today, except for the subsequent decline in sea turtle population. Land animals did not fare as well, however, and soon the giant iguanas, the megapodes, 24 other bird species, almost all pigeons, and all but 1 species of fruit bat were extinct. The Lapitans hunted and cooked these animals with shell and stone tools. Food preparation of animal and plant resources featured the use of hammerstones, weaving weights, cooking stones, and by exploratory foraging and trade they obtained hard obsidian from the far northern volcano of Tafahi in the Niues. They had household-produced pottery, and this ceramic industry had the dentate impressions and simple designs that were characteristic of all Lapita settlements in the South Pacific. Tongan Lapita designs were simpler than Western Lapita designs, evolving from ornate curvilinear and rectilinear patterns into simple rectilinear forms. The pottery was slab-built earthenware of andesitic tephra clay mixed with calcareous or mineral sand tempers and fired at a low temperature. Decades of archaeological excavations of ancient Lapita kitchens and middens in Tonga Tapu and hapai have taught us much about early Tongan settlement, and we know what they ate, what tools they used, where they settled. Each had settlements of different sizes. One colony on Wiha, Kavai, and Foa, and 2 colonies on Lefuka, for example. Now, why the Lapitan diaspora? In 3500 BP, or 1500 BC, the Lapitan diaspora began from Papua New Guinea. By 2850 BP, or 900 BC, they were already in Tonga, meaning they virtually spreaded east for 300 years. They traveled in small wooden boats over open ocean to invisible destinations faster than the European colonizers walked across their continent. Archaeologists wonder what would compel people to embark on statistically suicidal missions. It doesn't appear that population pressure was a problem, because most Lapitan islands were sparsely inhabited and could have supported much higher populations, especially if they had turned more towards available root crops. They spread through the South Pacific quickly because as agricultural mariners they maintained their tribal, agricultural, social cohesiveness by turning their energy from what would otherwise have produced surplus social product into new settlement construction. And secondly, as simple chiefdoms, their leaders furthered most effectively this construction, more so than the tribal councils or elders, especially as the inter-island distances of the Road of the Winds made centralized leadership the smartest approach to decision-making in the social compact to which all adhered. The Lapita settlers in Tonga abandoned their ornate pottery tradition for the same reason all ceramic-producing peoples on the road to advanced theocratic chiefdom and early slave stage society do everywhere else in the world. As a simple chiefdom evolves into the next stage, it does so accompanied by the inherent professional specialization of a variety of tasks, especially in the creation of utilitarian pottery. Household production, with its inherent tendency to individualization of style within established patterns, moves to the producing guild's elimination of unnecessary decoration. The mechanics justifying the diaspora. Professor Kirch, Patrick Vinton Kirch, in The Lapita Peoples, Ancestors of the Oceanic World, published by Blackwell in 1997 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, has explained the mechanics of how Lapitan culture encouraged emigration. It was by the younger son's traditional direction outward from the holdings of the agricultural mariner households. Not just in Tonga, but throughout the South Pacific, there was ethnographically a tradition of passing down land to the eldest sons. This ethnographic model has its origins in prehistoric Oceania. To obtain their own land, younger sons needed to explore. Ideological justification in the Tongan ATC had Tangaloa, the chief of Tongan god, as a younger sibling who accidentally created Tonga while searching for land from a canoe. And in this story, his fish hook caught on a rock on the ocean floor, and he was able to pull Tonga to the surface. In the real world, there would have been strong sibling rivalry to leave for faraway New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island. Now we come to the Polynesian plainware that marks the start of Polynesia. Life began to change drastically for the Hapians at the same time that ornate pottery was replaced by a strictly utilitarian plainware kit, that is between 2650 and 1550 BP, or 700 BC to AD 400. One could say, therefore, that Polynesian plainware marks the beginning of Polynesia as a cultural area. Of all the linguistically and traditional similar peoples who came to inhabit the triangle created by New Zealand, Hawaii, and Easter Island, they can all trace ancestries to a few original settlers in Tonga. These original Polynesians in Tonga expanded their mode of production to an increased reliance on agriculture and animal husbandry. Taro, yam, and breadfruit, and banana became principal carbohydrate sources, and domesticated animals came to represent much more of the diet. Of course, they continued to get a great deal of protein from seafood, and wild birds of all types. Professor David V. Burley from Simon Fraser University in British Columbia has concentrated on the sociocultural evolution of Tonga. He reports that at original Lapita sites, 24% of bird bones came from chickens, which increased after the Polynesian transformation into 81%, marking probably the demise of other bird species as well as an increased reliance on domesticated species. And then I give the reference for one of his most important articles in that regard. The transition from maritime tribal farming occurs with the introduction of more energy-supportive food sources. This new mode of production made simple chiefdom organization of society totally reasonable and desirable when the farms were spread out over many islands and islets, and the new economy allowed a population explosion. The transition to advanced theocratic chiefdom level of sociocultural evolution and its ramifications can be seen when a 25 by 40 meter Lapitan hamlet grew into village over 1 kilometer in length. Settlement grew around most of the lagoon in Tonga Tapu, and villages finally reached the interior of the main island. Similar expansions have been identified in the Niuas and in Vavua. Now, to archaeologists, these early Polynesians provide a mystery just as perplexing as in Lapitans, because by 1550 BP, or 400 AD, they ceased to produce any pottery at all. They seem to have turned towards natural materials. So we have the question, why did Tongans stop making pottery? One of the most unexpected implications of the revision of the Tongan pottery sequence is that, on present evidence, the founding of rich shellfish middens appears to have stopped at virtually the same time that pottery ceased being used. Pottery in Tonga is invariably associated with shellfish midden remains, and inversely, there are no reported middens without pottery. The cessation of pottery and midden building is sufficiently convincing to suggest that toward the end of the first millennium BC, there was a significant shift in the orientation of prehistoric Tongan economy. A shift in environment could have led to a reduction in shellfish supplies. However, shellfish from Vuki's Mound are as large as those from the earlier sites, so that reef was not being overexploited, nor is there evidence for tectonic activity at about this time, which could have altered the reef and disrupted the environment for the shellfish. There is clear evidence for uplift preceding or coinciding with initial settlement. All the pottery-bearing sites are on an old, clean coral sand lagoon bottom with water-washed coral fingers and shells. There is now evidence in the middens of slow infilling of the lagoon following the uplift that might have altered the reef environment and diminished shellfish supplies. In fact, the heavy Anadromata and Galfrarium shellfish that comprise the bulk of the midden remains are still readily available from the reef and lagoons. I think there was a shift from reef exploitation to agriculture in the latter half of the first millennium BC. The introduction of the major West Pacific cultigens, taro, yam, banana, coconut, and breadfruit, as well as the pig-made reliance on land farming, the more attractive and productive mode of production. The pig is usually associated with horticulture, and its presence in the impressed and incised wear levels in Fiji is sound evidence for the establishment of a viable horticulture by this period. The Lapita site locations prove its makers were restricted to littoral exploitation, that is, of the littoral part of the landscape, usually in a coral lagoon environment. This is apparent from the invariably coastal or offshore island location of Lapita sites. In fact, there is the astonishing failure of the Lapita potteries to expand and exploit the attractive and uninhabited vastness of the Fijian Islands, despite the fact that they were apparently the sole occupants for over 600 years. It is not until much later, when either the Lapita style had completely changed or a new people had arrived, that the rich Fijian Islands began to be systematically settled by people who were undoubtedly agriculturalists. Much the same appears to be true in New Caledonia, where people with Lapita-style pottery were the first, or among the first, settlers of this rich island. The poverty of Lapita sites in New Caledonia suggests that these early settlers failed to expand into the agricultural interior and were rapidly displaced or submerged by people with different pottery styles. Nowhere except in Tonga, and perhaps in Fiji, did these earliest settlers in the Western Pacific leave a noticeable impact upon the present population structure. Their success in Tonga, as in Fiji, if impressed where is a development from Lapita, appears to correlate with the shift from lagoonal to horticultural orientation witnessed by the switch in shellfish dumping and the dependence upon reef food. The Lapita potters had a restricted maritime lagoonal economy. Then the introduction of a more plant and animal domesticated economy created a superior horticultural economy. This new mode of production enabled these tribal farming mariners to expand and to survive in Fiji and Tonga, and to eventually colonize the remainder of the Pacific. This hypothesis also offers a convenient explanation for the midden cessation in Tonga, as well as the genesis of the astonishingly rapid colonization of the Western Pacific before 1000 BC by people with Lapita ware. My own synthesis is that the mode of production shifted focus in ATC times to agriculture over marine resources. As the people became more farmers than sailors, the population concentration pattern changed from the typical land-based ATC pattern of city and nearby field-based worker population to the quite different pattern on the Road of the Winds. Delivery of pottery to workers and their families from professionally specialized production factories is one thing on the land. It is quite another when the agricultural workers are spread out on hundreds of islands over thousands of square miles. In these latter circumstances, it would be far more efficient for agricultural workers to rely on containers made locally by them. The agricultural working population would not have had to reinvent ceramics because they could rely on their traditional technology of wooden containers, bamboo utilitarian containers, coconut containers, gourd containers, and woven materials of plated, woven, twine, coiled, and netted materials. This would have relieved the center, that is, the ATC chief, or later the slave stage king, from the cost and responsibility of delivering utilitarian pottery to the hundreds of producing islands and islets. It would diminish the power of a hitherto always powerful guild that also meant a group in a position to challenge the monarch. Remember that the concentration of the boss hierarchy at Nan Madol proves that the center was always acutely on the watch for all possible sources of anti-center rebellion. And that brings to a conclusion my comments on the first part of our lecture on Polynesia.